how the rich use debt to get richer, and why you're taught the opposite. Most people grow up hearing the same advice. Stay out of debt. Pay off your loans as fast as possible. If you can't afford it in cash, don't buy it. On the surface, it sounds responsible, safe, even wise. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The wealthiest people in the world follow a completely different set of rules. They don't avoid debt. They use it strategically, relentlessly, and often. They use other people's money to build their own wealth at a scale that would be impossible otherwise. So what's really going on here? Let's break it down. First, you need to understand that not all debt is the same. The average person sees debt as a burden, something that takes money out of your pocket every month. Credit card balances, car loans, personal loans. These are what we call consumer debt. They fund lifestyles, not assets. They don't generate income. They drain it. Now compare that to how the wealthy think about debt. To them, debt is a tool, a lever, something that can amplify returns. Instead of borrowing to spend, they borrow to invest. That distinction changes everything. Imagine two people. One person takes out a loan to buy a luxury car. The car loses value over time. It doesn't generate income. Meanwhile, the loan requires monthly payments, plus interest. This is a losing equation. Now the second person takes out a loan to buy a rental property. That property generates monthly cash flow. Ideally, the rent covers the loan payments and leaves extra income on top. Over time, the property may also increase in value. The debt stays fixed, but the asset grows. Same concept of borrowing. Completely different outcome. This is the foundation of how the rich use debt. They focus on acquiring assets that produce income, not liabilities that consume it. But there's a deeper layer to this. Debt allows them to control assets they couldn't otherwise afford. Let's say a property costs $1 million. Instead of paying the full amount in cash, they put down a fraction and borrow the rest. Now they control $1 million asset with a much smaller upfront investment. If that property increases in value, the gain is based on the full asset value, not just the initial cash invested. That's leverage. Leverage magnifies outcomes. When things go right, it accelerates wealth building. When things go wrong, it can amplify losses. The wealthy understand this risk, but they also know how to manage it. They don't rely on a single investment. They diversify. They structure deals carefully. They focus on assets that produce steady cash flow, which can cover the cost of borrowing. And most importantly, they make sure the debt is tied to something productive. This brings us to another key point: cash flow. For the average person, debt is something you pay with your income. Your job funds your liabilities. For the wealthy, it works the other way around. Their assets generate income, and that income services the debt. In other words, they don't pay for the debt. The investment pays for itself. Over time, as the debt gets paid down and the asset continues producing income, the owner builds equity and wealth simultaneously. This is why you often hear that the rich get richer. They're not just saving money. They're using systems that compound their returns. Now let's talk about taxes. This is where things get even more interesting. In many systems, interest on investment-related debt can be deducted. Expenses tied to income-generating assets can reduce taxable income. Meanwhile, appreciation in asset value isn't always taxed until the asset is sold. This creates a powerful advantage. The wealthy can grow their assets, generate income, and reduce their tax burden at the same time. Compare that to someone earning a salary. Their income is taxed first, then they spend what's left. And if they use debt, it's often for consumption, not investment. Different rules, different outcomes. Another strategy the wealthy use is something called refinancing. As an asset increases in value, they can borrow against that increased value. This allows them to access cash without selling the asset. Why does that matter? Because selling often triggers taxes. Borrowing does not. So instead of selling an investment and paying taxes on the gain, they borrow against it and use that money to fund new investments. This keeps the original asset working for them while opening the door to new opportunities. It's a cycle. Acquire assets, use debt to expand. Let cash flow support the structure. Reinvest and repeat. Now you might be wondering, if this is so effective, why isn't everyone doing it? The answer comes down to education, risk tolerance, and incentives. Most people are taught to be employees, not investors. The system encourages stability and predictability. Get a job, earn a steady income, avoid risk, follow the rules. And for many people, that path works. It provides security, but it doesn't maximize wealth. On top of that, using debt effectively requires knowledge. You need to understand markets, cash flow, risk management, and timing. Without that understanding, debt can become dangerous. That's why blanket advice like avoid all debt exists. It protects people from making costly mistakes, but it also limits their potential. There's also a psychological factor. Debt feels uncomfortable. It creates pressure. Most people associate it with stress and obligation. The wealthy reframe it. They see it as a calculated risk, tied to opportunity. That mindset shift is critical. Instead of asking, how do I avoid debt? They ask, how can I use debt to acquire something that pays me back? That single question leads to completely different decisions. Now, it's important to be clear about something. Using debt to build wealth is not about reckless borrowing. It's not about chasing trends or taking on more risk than you can handle. It's about discipline. It's about making sure the numbers make sense. It's about having a margin of safety. The wealthy don't just borrow blindly. They analyze deals. They stress test assumptions. They plan for downside scenarios. They also maintain access to liquidity. Cash reserves matter. When markets shift, having flexibility can make the difference between surviving and being forced out. Another overlooked aspect is time. Wealth built through leveraged assets doesn't happen overnight. It's a long-term game. Properties appreciate over years. Businesses grow gradually. Compounding takes time to show its full effect. The difference is that leverage accelerates the process compared to relying on savings alone. If you only use your own money, growth is limited by how much you can earn and save. If you use debt wisely, you can scale beyond that limit. But again, the keyword is wisely. Let's bring it all together. The average person is taught to avoid debt because they're exposed mainly to bad forms of it. High interest, consumption-driven, and tied to depreciating assets. The wealthy use debt differently. They use it to acquire income-producing assets, amplify returns through leverage, optimize taxes, and maintain control of growing investments. Same concept, completely different execution. And that's why the results look so different. Understanding this doesn't mean you should rush out and take on debt. It means you should start seeing it for what it is, a tool. Used incorrectly, it can hold you back for years. Used correctly, it can accelerate your path to financial independence. The key is education, discipline, and strategy. Because the real divide isn't between people who use debt and people who don't. It's between those who understand it and those who don't. If you found this breakdown useful and want more insights like this, hit subscribe and stay tuned for the next video.